In this week's video, we're going back to portrait painting. Here's a few close-up shots of the final painting, and I want to show you this so you can see what kind of detail we get using this technique. For this lesson, I'm using an Iwata micron and createx illustration colors, and I'm usually spraying right around 20 psi. I'm also trying to speak louder in this video and kind of project my voice a bit more because people keep telling me that I'm too quiet or I'm whispering, so I want to try to do the best I can to give you clear audio. So the first thing I'm putting up on the screen is a high resolution photo of the final painting. In this lesson, I decided not to show the reference photo. The reason for that is that my painting is much simpler than the reference photo. Although a portrait like this is difficult, I want to try to make it as beginner friendly as possible. I'm also placing up a gridded version of this, which is 1x1. So if you'd like to use that to transfer over to your canvas, you're welcome to. Taking a look at this simple color wheel that I made in Photoshop, we're going to start mixing our flesh tones. It doesn't matter which ethnicity we're painting, all flesh tones in natural light are a muted orange. So when I mix skin tones, I always start with an orange and then desaturate it with complementary colors. If you're an oil painter, you'll know that one of the easiest ways to mix a flesh tone is by starting with burnt umber. Along with the primary colors and white, I think burnt umber is an essential color for everyone to have. It's basically a muted dark orange color. If we spray it directly out of the bottle, you'll see that the color is a little bit too orange for a natural skin tone, so we're going to have to adjust it. The first thing I'd like to do is shift that color to a reddish orange. I found red violet to be a great color because not only is it red, but it also has a bit of blue in there. That way it's going to help knock down some of that orange color. So I start out by adding about 15 or 20 drops of burnt umber. I suggest always mixing your colors in small little cups like this. I don't like mixing them in the airbrush. I think it just gets too messy that way. You also have way more control of your colors mixing them in separate cups. Now I'm going to add some red violet to it, adding about the same amount, 15-20 drops. This way we're going to have a reddish orange color. I like my paint on the thinner side, so I use about 20-30% distilled water. You want to make sure you're using distilled water here, not tap water. Of course, reducers work well too, like 4011 or 4012 reducer. I just found that water seems to break down the binder a little bit more. It makes it way easier for me to erase the paint, so it's just what I prefer. I like to mix the paint on one of these mini vortex mixers. I feel like it really does a good job at mixing the colors together. And then once I'm done with that, I check the color. You can see here that we get a very deep reddish orange. This color is in the ballpark of what we want, but it's way too saturated. It's way too bright of a reddish color, so we're going to have to use some other colors, complementary colors, to desaturate it. So I cut a square in a piece of paper and place it over my reference photo. This way we block out the majority of the reference photo just to focus on the color of that flesh tone. From here, I'm going to lightly spray this flesh tone on another piece of paper just on the edge of it, and we're going to compare the colors next to each other. If I slide this color underneath that cutout, we can see that this color is really close to what we want for this mixture, just using burnt umber and red violet. To get darker values in the flesh tone, what we're going to do is we're going to have to spray more of this paint. What's going to happen is more of that paint is going to cover up the white of the paper, and what we're going to do is we're going to get to see more of a reddish color, and this is going to actually hurt us when we're working on an actual painting. The color is not going to look natural. So while this color matches really well for light tones, it's not going to work that well for darker tones, so we're going to adjust it. Before we adjust it, I just want to show you an example of what I'm talking about. So here I'm spraying at 100%. If I place this color on a darker part of the portrait, like near the cheek here, you can see that this color is way too red. It just doesn't look natural at all. So in order to knock out some of that red, we're going to have to use the complement of red, which is green. So I'm going to use some moss green here, just a few drops into the mixture to see what we get. It's always easier to knock down the saturation of a color than to pull it back up. So from experience, I usually mix a brighter orange or reddish color, and then I knock it down with the complement, either some blue or some green. So after spraying this color on another piece of blank paper, we could see that these two colors are very close. So this is what I'm going to use for my basic flesh tone. Although we adjusted it, this color is still going to be too red for some of those darker colors, so we're going to adjust the values later on using some sepia and black sprayed over this color. I'm painting this portrait on gessoed canvas that I prepared myself. Down below in the video description, I'll have a link to a video I made showing you how to set one up yourself. To transfer your outlines or your contours over to your canvas, you can use any sort of technique you like. I use grids and freehand drawing because that's really my background in college and grad school, but you could use anything you like. If you want to use a projector, you could use that. If you want to use grids, I think that's the best. You could also trace it by printing out a large image. On portraits, I always find it's easiest to start with the eye. That's just my preference. So here I'm starting with the left eye, and I mixed a color of about 10 parts blue to 3 or 4 parts black. And I'm using a shield that I printed myself and just using this to get in these sharp lines around the outside of the eye here. You can see in real time how slow I actually go when I paint this. I'm eventually going to be speeding this video up, so it's not 30 hours long, which is how long it took me to do the painting, but you have to go slow and just make sure you look at what you put down and then step back and decide if you want to adjust it or if you want to clean up some edges. It's just so important to go slow, so don't ever rush or think that you're in some race to finish a portrait. To paint in the pupil, I'm using the same color and using this small shield that I bought, I believe from Drew Blair's website, and it's just a small circle template. Of course, we're going to have to adjust the color of that pupil later on. We're going to have to switch it to a darkish brownish black color. But for now, since we have that color in the airbrush, we could just spray it lightly to kind of map out parts of the eye. Going back to my shield here, I'm going to lightly spray over the top part of this iris, and this way we're going to define the edge. You can see here that I usually switch back to an eraser to clean up some of the edges. If you look at the reference painting, you'll see that there's a very bright specular highlight on the right side of this iris. A specular highlight is a highlight that's directly reflecting the light source. We want to make sure we keep that very bright white. Switching over to freehand, I'm going to add in some of these darker values within the iris, and I'm also going to darken up that pupil. I can see now that I basically have the iris mapped in, so I'm going to start committing more paint to it. This way I'm going to darken it up, and we're going to add some more dimension to it, some more of a 3D effect where we have darker edges around the outside and then lighter as we get toward the middle, toward that pupil. And just like the flesh tone, this color is 100% transparent, so we adjust the value, meaning the dark and the lightness of the color, by how much we spray. So you start light just by spraying a small amount, and then to darken up, you just add more and more paint. You can see that pupil there, it almost looks black, and that's really the same color, the blue-black mixture. And the reason that pupil looks so dark is just because there's more paint there. So that's a great thing about transparent colors. You can always darken them up almost to pure black by the amount you spray. Now I'm going to switch over to the color sepia, and we're going to use this to paint in the sclera, which is the white part of the eye. Using my shield along these eyelids here, I'm just going to spray a tiny bit of this sepia along the edges. Now I do apologize right here for the screen shake. My compressor went on and I forgot to stop the video. So just a bit of that color is going to help darken it up. Even though they're called the whites of the eye, there's never pure white in them. They're always a slight, maybe a yellowish or a brownish color, always slightly off-white. So we're going to use some of this sepia here, and it looks a little dark now. It's because the outside is all pure white. But you'll see as we start putting on the other color, this is going to look correct. And if it's a little too dark, we could always knock back some of it by erasing into it. Now the only way to get that bright specular highlight looking really bright is to have dark values around it. So using the same color, the sepia, I'm going to work my way around this eye, start darkening the edges, and just building up the value so it has a darker tone to it. This side of the face is actually going to be in kind of a bit of a cast shadow, so it's going to be much darker than the other side of the face where the light's reflecting. So we're just going to work on this, slowly building it up. Never want to jump to that darkest value right away. Just go slow, build it up, and as you can see, as we start adding more of this, that bright highlight in the middle starts to look brighter. And of course we know we didn't change the value of that specular highlight. All we did was darken the areas around it. There's also a few smaller specular highlights here, so I'm switching over to my Dremel, which is an electric eraser, and just tapping these in, and then switching over to an X-Acto blade to help sharpen these up a little bit more. You can get them really bright by pulling out the paint with that blade. I'm putting a cropped out section of the final painting on the screen now. This way you could see what we're working to achieve as we eventually build up. You're going to see that we don't get to this right away. It's a slow process of building up values. So switching to the flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of this video and using a shield, I'm going to start spraying in some of these lines above the eye and some of the wrinkles, just very, very lightly. We're going to use this one color for the majority of the portrait. So you have to learn to spray lightly and control your values by how much paint you apply. As I'm adding in the first few layers of these flesh tones, I'm making sure that I pull back the tiniest bit on my trigger, basically pulling back like 1/4 of a millimeter, just lightly putting the paint on. If I pulled back all the way and hosed this paint on, it would look almost like a pure reddish black color. So we just have to go nice and slow and build this up. You can see some of these look a little splotchy and kind of messy. That's okay, it's no big deal. We could eventually erase into it, clean them up, and use that to kind of add to some of our skin texture. Since this portrait is of an older man, we're going to have to add some more textures and wrinkles above that eyelid. So here I'm using that skin texture template and lightly placing it over the top eyelid and then spraying on top of it. Just like before, just pulling back maybe 1/4 of a millimeter and just seeing what sort of spots I get there. I'm making sure that I just keep them above the eye. I'll eventually switch over to my eraser to pull out some highlights on top of these to make it look like some sort of bumps. So when we're using the skin texture template like this, we're basically adding in small shadows. And of course, this could be done freehand, but what's nice about using a template like this is that when you spray over it, you get a very random sequence, and to try to do that by hand is very difficult to do. It may sound strange to new painters, but painting in random areas is extremely difficult. It really goes against our nature. We like things lined up, so trying to get a random pattern is actually quite difficult to do. So if you can use some sort of tool like a shield or a skin texture template to help you out, that's the way to go. When you're spraying with an airbrush, you're always going to get some overspray. So I'm switching back to my eraser and my X-Acto blade and just cleaning up some of these brighter areas again to make them white. Now, I don't generally like telling people that there's a specific rule that you need to follow, but one thing that generally happens in portrait painting is the colors shift from a warm tone to a cooler tone as they go from a brighter area to a darker area. And this doesn't happen 100% of the time, but in most cases in natural light, you're going to see that color shift from a warmer tone in the highlight to a cooler tone in the shadow. Since we know that our flesh tone is very warm, it's that reddish orange color, we're going to have to use a cooler color to add in some of these shadows. So that's what I did here. I switched over to sepia and I'm spraying it over these darker shadows to not only darken them up and change the value, but also change the temperature so that it's cooler. It's very important to never spray this cooler color on the blank canvas. You can see that I sprayed it over my original flesh tone. The reason for this is that flesh tone, little bits of it are still going to show through that sepia color. So we're basically optically mixing them. When you spray with an airbrush, the paint's atomized, meaning that it's spraying millions of tiny little dots. So when you spray the little dots of sepia over that original flesh tone, it's going to mix optically and you're going to see it as a cooler color, but you're still going to retain some of that original flesh tone in it. It's not going to be a huge shift, from red to a brownish color immediately. Now, as you can see to the right of the eye, there's a very dark cast shadow being cast from the nose. So since I know that color is going to be so dark later on, I'm going to actually spray sepia first, and this is going to be my warmer tone. I'm going to lightly spray it in, kind of map out where this cast shadow is going to be, and then when I'm comfortable with the position later on, I'll switch over to black and lightly spray that, optically mix it right on top of the sepia. We could spend hours talking about basic color theory, so I hope I'm not confusing anyone going with this, but just know that to simplify things, we're basically using 3 colors on the skin tone. We're mixing the color that we mixed in the beginning of the video, then we're using sepia for the shadows, and then on top of that, if we want really dark areas, we're going to use pure black, but the base color is always going to be that initial flesh tone that we mixed. So with those colors in, we're getting a basic shape, a basic form of this eye, and I want to add some texture to it because it looks too smooth. So switching over to my Dremel tool, which is my eraser, I'm just tapping out a few bright highlights in it. I'm also going to add in some small dots here with the shield. This is basically like our skin texture template. This is the Drew Blair version, and just lightly spray a few of those on top of it. Again, we're just trying to break up that soft look of the airbrush. So if you're watching this video to learn how to paint, I can teach you the techniques to use, but the one thing I really can't teach you is your observation skills, and that is really the most important thing in art. That's something that I think is a lifelong thing. It's something you constantly improve at. I've been painting for a long time and I still feel like I'm learning to see better. And I think one of the best ways to learn or improve your skills in observation is to make mistakes over and over. I noticed right here as I was putting down these eyelashes, I kind of put them in the wrong direction. And I looked at my reference angle and I realized they were wrong. And those mistakes really help you to see what you need to improve your painting. It's just hard to explain, but I think what I'm trying to say is that it's good to make these mistakes, and each one of those, even though it's painful and you feel like you failed, each one of those failures is also a small accomplishment because it's going to help you out and it's going to teach you to see better and translate that vision onto your canvas. And if you watched any of my other painting lessons, you'll know that anytime I want to add in small details, I usually use a colored pencil. So that's what I did here. I used a black colored pencil for those eyelashes and just kind of flick them out from the top part of the eyelash down to the iris. Also, while I'm working on this here, I'm switching over to my eraser and just pulling out a few of the highlights on this top section. If the highlights are too bright, it's no big deal because we could always spray that flesh color right over the top of them and darken them back down. So now let's start mapping out some of these wrinkles around the outside of the eye. I'm switching over to my shield here and going back to our original flesh tone, I'm lightly spraying in a few of these larger wrinkles that are coming out of the side of the eye here. As I'm looking at my reference photo, I can see that these wrinkles, the larger ones around the outside of the eye here, have a defined sharp edge to them, so the shield works well for this. Now if I look above the eye, a lot of these more subtle or smaller wrinkles have an organic edge to them. They're kind of bumpy and they're not sharp and smooth like a shield. So the best tool for this is a small ripped piece of paper. I'm going to slow this video down to real time so you can see what I'm doing here with the ripped piece of paper. But if you watched my last video, I explained the different tools that you can make and different types of shields and masks that you already have at home. And one of them is using a ripped piece of paper. I like cardstock because it has a little bit more rigidity to it. And all I do is just tear it and I get these little random curves, and the edge of it has a nice subtle bump or texture to it, and when you spray over that, you get a very nice looking edge, and it's such a simple way to add a nice organic texture. Now you have to be careful when you're spraying on any sort of shield or even a ripped piece of paper, because if you spray too much, that line's going to be way too sharp and defined. So as I spray this, I try to spray very lightly, but another thing I do is I try to basically spray on the paper, and that overspray is going to spray off the edge of it, and it's going to give me a very subtle line. I would definitely spray a few test patterns on a blank piece of paper to try to basically get the hang of this before you jump into the portrait, but all you're really doing is spraying on the paper, and that overspray is going to get onto the canvas itself, and you're going to get a much softer and more subtle line. And if you do get it a little bit too dark, it's not a big deal because you could erase it back out. But if you spray 100% and you really put that paint on there, it's nearly impossible to get it back out, or if you do erase it, it looks very sloppy. So just try to go light. Of course, every single shadow is always going to have a highlight, so using my eraser, I just pulled out a few highlights just above these shadows, and also I could use something like my X-Acto blade to pull out some very small specular highlights, maybe look like some tiny little flyaway hairs or something going on in the skin. When you're using any sort of erasing techniques, it's best to really experiment with all different types. Try the X-Acto blades and try electric erasers. See what you like the best to pull out highlights, because sometimes you'll see that an eraser is a little bit too aggressive, so maybe you're going to use that for specular highlights, or maybe another one doesn't pull out enough paint, so you can use that for more subtle highlights. You just have to play around and see which eraser works best for you, and you'll eventually find which one you want to use when you want to pull out a specific highlight. From personal experience, I know I like to use the pencil erasers for soft highlights, for basically subtle erasing. That's the Mars Razor and the Faber-Castell 7058B, which I'll have linked down below. And then for the more aggressive ones, I'll use an electric eraser, and for pure bright highlights, I always switch to the X-Acto blade or an old airbrush needle. The eraser I'm using right now is the Mars Razor made by Staedtler, and to erase this out, I'm just using it like a normal eraser, and what I like about these is that I can control how much paint I pull out by the amount of pressure I use. If I really press on that eraser onto the canvas, a lot more paint's going to pull out, but if I use lighter pressure, you just get a more subtle removal of paint. So it's nice to kind of play around with the amount of paint that you can pull out. And if you really want to pull out a lot of paint, I always switch to a razor blade or an X-Acto blade to get a very sharp, thin highlight. Going back to the airbrush with the flesh tone, I'm going to darken some of these areas up here, especially around the bridge of the nose and on the left side of this eye. When I'm adding in skin textures, one thing I like to do is kind of play around with the different styles you can get. So here I'm starting with freehand and just kind of spraying little random dots. And when you spray with the airbrush, you get a very, very soft circle or dot laid in there. And then if I want those sharper dots, I'll switch to my shield, the skin texture template, and then lightly spray over the top of that. And it's just nice to kind of mix those two. It looks like a lot more is going on there, and it looks like we spent a lot more work on it where it only took us, a minute or two. Now I'm going to start mapping in the first few layers of the eyebrows. So in order to do that, I need to lay down some paint first. So just spraying some paint on the top so I have something to work with. I could switch over to my X-Acto blade and start pulling out some of these highlights. This is very easy to do. You're just basically drawing with the blade. One thing you got to keep in mind though is that a razor blade is always going to pull out better in one direction because there's a burr at the end of it. I say this in all my videos, so if it's not cutting well, just try pulling out in the other direction. Switch from left to right or right to left. Below that eyebrow, I want to add in some more skin textures, so I'm using the Mars Razor eraser and just erasing in very small circular motions. This is a great way to add some kind of randomness to that skin texture. And what I like about using this is you kind of see some of the canvas coming through, and I just think it's a cool look to the image. So give that a shot. Just try erasing in small circular motions and you get a nice organic looking texture. As I start adding in more layers of paint, trying to darken up some areas, you're going to notice that that eyebrow starts to disappear. All those highlights we pulled out are kind of pushed away in the background. Now this is actually a good thing because those are going to look like hairs farther away from us, and now when I switch back to my X-Acto blade and pull out some hair on top of it, it's going to look like there's a lot more depth going on in there. There's like some hairs that are far away in the background, they look a little bit lighter, and the ones that are bright look like they're in the foreground closest to us, like they're catching more light. So it's always good to build up layers slowly and then use those original textures to kind of lay the foundation for the next few layers. Switching to this area right underneath the eye, we're going to do the same thing. Start with that ripped piece of paper and start adding in some of these wrinkles. Once that's done, we're going to add some more color with the airbrush and then always switch over to an eraser later down the road to pull out some of those highlights. And I just want to point out that I'm still using the exact same flesh tone as before. It's kind of my base or my foundation for every bit of skin texture I lay down and really all the shading on the face. So once the first layer is down, we just put it in nice and light, and then we can darken it if we want by spraying more paint on top of it. I usually like to let it dry for a minute or so, see what it looks like, and then add more. But then of course, like we talked about before, if we need to shift the temperature for a darker area like a cast shadow, then we can use that sepia or some black to spray on top of it. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that one of the most important things is your observation, how well you can see your reference or your subject and then translate that onto your canvas. So I want you to do that here. I want you to look at what I'm working on. I'm not going to explain every little bit here, that's why I'm speeding this up. But try to decide where you see highlights, where you see shadows, where the color kind of shifts, and think about how you're going to approach it. You know, there's no right way and there's no correct way to paint. You can go about it any way you like. Maybe you want to start with the skin texture template first and lay down texture all over that blank canvas. Maybe you want to start with the dark cast shadow on the right. It doesn't really matter. There's tons of ways to paint. I think what's most important is to find a style that's best for yourself, that you're most comfortable with, because then when you go on to paint more advanced pictures like this one, you'll have some confidence and understand, you know, the best approach. One last technique I want to talk about in this video before we finish this up is using the skin texture template to add some lines like this. So what I do is I spray on it and basically pull the skin texture template up and down. I'm basically spraying and moving the airbrush and the skin texture template together, you know, in sync, and you get these very soft, subtle lines in the background, and it's a cool way just to kind of add something a little bit different to it. I noticed in the reference photo that there seems to be some very thin lines in the back here on this side of the face, and using the skin texture template and the shield like that in a moving motion gives you a very different texture and just kind of a unique look. Next week we're going to get into more detail about the hair, but let me just tell you a bit about what I'm doing here so I can give you a sense of what's going on. So I'm using sepia here, and I masked off the left side of the head just to get a sharp line, and then lightly sprayed some sepia on. The reason for that is I want to pull out my hair with my erasers and my X-Acto blade. So once that paint is down, I have something to erase into. So sepia seems to work well for kind of like graying hair. And then once that's in, I just switch between my eraser and my razor blade and just slowly pull out highlight after highlight. And when pulling out hair, it's really important to pull out large clumps of hair or locks of hair rather than individual hairs. When we look at hair, we're kind of seeing masses of highlights and masses of shadow rather than individual hairs. Of course, there's going to be some small flyaway hairs and things like that, but it's really important to focus on that macro highlight and shadow of hair transitions, and I'll talk about that more next week when we start the second part of this video. So that's going to complete the first part of this. I hope you enjoyed it, and of course I hope you picked up a thing or two. So if you're working on copying this portrait and you're finding some parts of it challenging, that's not a big deal, because like I said before, I've been painting for a long time and this is definitely a difficult portrait. So don't worry about making those mistakes. Mistakes are really going to teach you what you need to do to improve your painting in the future. Just don't lose confidence when you're working, and try to have fun. Try to enjoy that process that, you know, of being alone and working one-on-one with the painting. I think it's a very important thing in this time. So we're going to stop this video here, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.